All right, let's talk about ancient Egypt. And I mean really talk about it. We're going way beyond just pyramids and pharaohs. Today, we're going to dig into the incredible story of its resilience. How this civilization wasn't just one long story, but a series of dramatic cycles of collapse and rebirth.
So that brings us to the big question, right? How does a civilization even last for 3,000 years? I mean, that's just an almost unimaginable length of time. And the secret, the key to its longevity, wasn't that it was one single continuous empire. No, not at all. It was actually a series of distinct civilizations, each one literally rising from the ashes of the one before it.
And you can break this huge sweep of history down into three main chapters. First, you've got the Old Kingdom. The classic pyramid builders. Then comes the Middle Kingdom, which was kind of a golden age of social justice. And finally, the Empire, a period all about military might and conquest. What's so fascinating is that each one had a completely different playbook for how to rule. Let's get into it.
So let's start at the beginning with the Old Kingdom. This is really the foundation of everything we think of as Egyptian civilization. And its government was built on this one really wild idea. It wasn't a government for people. It was a government for the gods.
And the word for that is a theocracy. Basically, the pharaoh wasn't just some king who inherited the throne. No, he was seen as the divine son of the sun god, Re. So his power didn't come from politics or armies. It was celestial. He was literally the god's representative here on Earth.
And it's really interesting to see how this all played out in practice. I mean, sure, the pharaoh's power was immense, but it wasn't absolute. It was actually limited by ancient laws that everyone believed were the direct will of the gods. And get this is a key detail. They had no standing army. None. This whole state was built on peace and cooperation, protected by the desert and the Nile, and totally united by the shared faith in their divine ruler. And you know what? For about 1,000 years, this system worked. It created this incredible stability. But, well, nothing lasts forever, does it? The very thing that made the Old Kingdom so strong also turned out to be its biggest weakness.
And here's the problem in a nutshell. Slowly but surely, power started to drift away from the pharaoh. These local governors, they were called nomarchs, they started making their jobs hereditary, passing them down to their sons. Pretty soon, they were acting like little kings in their own districts. The pharaoh's divine authority just eroded. And with that, the Old Kingdom completely crumbled into chaos.
Okay, so after all that disorder, Egypt eventually gets put back together again. And this kicks off the Middle Kingdom. But things were different this time. They learned from the collapse, and the whole approach to government changed. It became, you could say, a lot more human.
So, what was the big shift? Well, think of it this way. In the Old Kingdom, all power flowed from the top down, from one divine pharaoh. But the Middle Kingdom? It spread the power out. A whole new class of powerful local nobles and governors popped up. Sure, the pharaoh was still the guy at the very top, but he wasn't the only game in town anymore. Not by a long shot.
And this change led to something really interesting, what some historians even called the first democratic kingdom. Now, power was in the hands of these local leaders, these sort of benevolent despots. And for the first time ever, regular people, the common folk, had real opportunities. They could get government jobs, they could own their own land, they had actual rights. It's really seen as this golden age of social justice in Egypt.
But here we go again. The pattern starts to repeat itself. That same decentralized power that created all this social justice, it also made the kingdom really fragile. Ambitious nobles started fighting amongst themselves, which weakened the state from the inside out, and that left the door wide open for an invasion. This time, it was a group called the Hyksos, and they swept in with brand new tech, horses and chariots, and brought the Middle Kingdom to a pretty violent end. Being occupied by a foreign power, that changes a country, and it changed Egypt forever. After they finally drove out the Hyksos, a new Egypt emerged. It was powerful, it was nationalistic, and it was called the Empire. And this wasn't a kingdom run by gods or nobles. Oh no, this was a state forged in the fires of war.
And their new guiding principle? Imperialism. I mean, just think back to that peaceful, isolationist Old Kingdom. This was the complete opposite. The thinking was, we just got invaded, never again. So that powerful military machine they built to kick out the Hyksos, they just turned it outwards, looking for conquest to build a buffer zone, an empire to protect themselves.
This new military-first mindset completely reshaped the entire country. The government of the empire was basically a military absolutism. The pharaoh's power wasn't about being a god anymore. It was about being the general of a massive professional army. That old nobility? Crushed. Their local power? Absolutely annihilated. Instead, the pharaoh appointed his own governors to rule, making sure he had absolute central control.
But of course, this new system created a whole new set of problems. As the empire got bigger and richer, so did the priesthood. And this is just incredible. At the height of the empire, the temples became so powerful that they owned 2% of the entire population as temple slaves. Just think about that for a second.
And right there you can see the new seeds of decay being planted. The endless cost of running an empire, plus staggering corruption at home, and all that wealth being siphoned off by the priests. It all started to fatally weaken the state. The empire, which was born from military strength, was now rotting from the inside out.
So, when we zoom out and look at the big picture, you see it, right? It's not one single story of ancient Egypt. It's really three stories. Three completely different answers to the fundamental question of how to run a society. And each one rose and then fell in this distinct, repeating pattern. And this really lays it all out. Look at the basis of rule. It goes from a theocracy to a decentralized nobility to a straight-up military machine. The pharaoh's power, it goes from absolute god-king to a much weaker figurehead, and then back to absolute, but as a general. And their policy towards the world? From peaceful and non-militaristic to weak and then to aggressive imperialism. I mean, these are three totally different ways of doing things, but we call them all ancient Egypt.
And every single time, they followed the same tragic cycle. You start with unification. That leads to stability and prosperity. But then, internal decay sets in. That decay leads to collapse and often invasion. And that chaos, in turn, creates the need for a new powerful leader to reunite everyone. And the whole cycle just starts all over again.
There's this quote all the way from the Old Kingdom that I think really gets to the heart of it. The power of righteousness is that it endures. It feels like through all these massive cycles of boom and bust, of rise and fall, what the Egyptians were always searching for was a just and stable way of life, a kind of righteousness that would finally last. And that leaves us with one last pretty big question to think about. When you look at this 3,000-year-long pattern of strength, then decay, then collapse, and then rebirth, it really makes you wonder, was this just a fluke, something unique to ancient Egypt? Or is this a fundamental cycle of history that maybe all great powers, even today, are destined to follow?